What was the most terrifying thing that you've experienced while staying in a hospital? Hearing the doctor say, "There is nothing we can do to save her." And then looking over and seeing tears coming out of my mom's eyes. She was intubated. Knowing she could hear everything but couldn't respond to us is something I still struggle with. Shit, her death is something I still struggle with. I love her and wish she didn't have to go the way she did. May not be scary, but knowing I would no longer have my mother anymore was pretty terrifying to me. I remember when swine flu was a relevant pandemic. I was 7 months pregnant at the time and early one morning woke up so violently sick and struggling to breathe. I was usually very fit and healthy. I passed out on the bathroom floor and came round to paramedics moving me. I felt just about fine when I came round, was chatting away in the back of the ambulance, insisting it was just a funny turn and only the husband panicking. I was deathly pale, but my obs seemed fine, but they were insistent on taking me to get checked over. We get to the hospital, I'm put in a side room on a bed, obs are again fine, and I'm just impatient to get home, but they still want to observe longer. I feel a little bit lightheaded, so I lay down. I start shivering, but any sort of movement to call the nurse felt like I was going to be sick. I started to have these weird visions like the hospital bed being on top of a really snowy mountain, climbing it, then crashing through the roof in a big jolt back onto the bed, hearing the heart rhythm on the machine all the while. For all this, I look at the machine, but it's like I've gone too cold to move, and it felt like I was watching it go slower and slower. It probably went by in moments, but it felt weirdly peaceful, like I was letting myself go, and as my eyes started shutting I'm being shaken and shouted at, and it's like I'm crashing back down to the bed in a jolt. I know the troll is being wheeled along the corridor, but it seems so long and wide and it's like I'm trying to keep up with it, but keep losing sight of it. Everything to go black and my name being called, and finding myself back on the bed looking up at a nurse, then each time falling off the bed out of my body. But it's like with each time my name's being called someone's picking me up from a big height and throwing me back down into the bed. Then I woke up in intensive care in one of those swine flu rooms. After being on the resus ward for 10 hours. I didn't know where time went at all. All of the above seemed to happen in the blink of an eye almost. It wasn't swine flu. My bloods, everything was fine. They couldn't say what caused it, but I was literally put on bed rest and fitted with a catheter for a few weeks to prevent whatever was causing it happening. It's still a mystery, but I certainly would have been dead now had I not been in hospital at that very time. Not really terrifying, but it could have been bad. But a few years ago I had to go into the hospital because I injured my hand. I thought it was broke. Thankfully it wasn't, but I was there for several hours. What was terrifying about it was the hospital was completely packed. In fact, I couldn't even get a room or office. I was treated in the hallway, and as I was waiting, they put chairs out there for all of us extras. I saw some of the local EMTs hanging out. I got to chatting with some of them, and I found out they were stuck there too. I asked why. It was because the hospital was so full they ran out of beds and they needed the gurneys, and they couldn't leave until they got one back. I asked them what would happen if there was an emergency and they needed to transport a patient now. They hung their heads, just replying, "Let's not hope it comes to that," because they had no gurney for them. Worst comes to worst, they'd have to call another city to see if they had some, which would increase their wait time for pickup. The horror of seeing the budget cuts and the overcrowding situation in the hospital was sad and frightening. I was glad for my own sake that I was able to get out relatively quickly, well, at least outpatient, and didn't have to stay there overnight on a chair or gurney at the possible expense of someone else possibly not getting the chance to be transported because they couldn't. That was scary to think about. Apparently it happens a lot in my area. It wasn't terrifying, but the most awful thing I've ever felt. I had a drain put in after having my gallbladder removed, and the next day the nurse came in to take it. That things was in there about 6/7 inches, right up into my stomach, and she just slowly pulled it out. Oh, I still shudder thinking about it. I was in a car accident with my mom back in 1999 here in Texas. A large van ran the red light at a four-way intersection and T-boned us. The accident was so bad they took us all by ambulance to the emergency room. The people who hit my mom and I were in the room next to us. The woman was heavily pregnant, but explained to the doctor something felt off for many weeks, but that a doctor in Mexico said the baby was fine. The doctors did an ultrasound and determined her baby was dead and that it wasn't due to the accident. They figured the baby had been dead for weeks. I'll never forget that woman's screams. It was heartbreaking. It was a mixture between heartbreak and disgust. She kept screaming, "Get it out of me, get it out of me." I'll never forget that moment. Was about 12 years old, got bit by a poisonous spider. In for it. The guy in the next curtain was apparently shot and stabbed with knife still in him. Nurses opened the curtain, didn't realize me and my dad were in the next area over, and so I saw a guy scream and holding in a knife in his gut. My wife used to work as a psych nurse at a hospital in the city we lived in. She was on the floor on the 4th of July about 10 years ago. I get a call from one of her coworkers telling me she'd been assaulted by a patient. She took a pretty good sucker punch and was down in the air to get checked out. Well, I'm with a couple of my friends and we all head in to see how she's doing. We are sitting with her as she's laying in one of the beds when we hear this awful wailing. We turn around and there's this kid. Maybe mid-teens. I can see the blood on his arm, running down and straining his clothes in the gurney. Turns out, he had blown his hand to shreds playing with fireworks. The screaming was extremely unnerving. My wife was okay, but that poor kid was not. As a young adult I was hospitalized due to sepsis. I was in the hospital for a few months. The first day I was transferred to a new hospital I heard this loud terrifying noise outside my door late at night and the ground started to rumble. I was in Florida so an earthquake was practically impossible, but I had no idea what else it could be. I sat paralyzed in my bed, heart pounding out of my chest. I finally worked up the courage to press the call button. You can imagine the chuckle the nurse had when she had to tell me it was just the floors being cleaned. I was panicked. It really wasn't that bad, but I was 5 and very scared. It was after waking up from anesthesia, after having my tonsils removed. Due to a genetic thing, painkillers or anything anesthetic doesn't really affect me. So I wake up, and I'm in a huge amount of pain. I'm surrounded by strangers and I can't talk. And then I see the bandage on my arm from the 4th and start crying. It felt like forever until my dad and mom were there, but definitely being alone, in pain and unable to voice it was the scariest thing for me. When I woke up in the hospital, buckled to the bed, and didn't know why I was there. Happened more than once, because it was for a brain injury and I couldn't remember why I was there, so I kept trying to escape. They ended up writing on a whiteboard at the end of my bed that I'm supposed to be there and stuff. I went to the ER 3 months ago for seizure-like symptoms. Turned out to be convulsive syncope and pretty treatable with an adjustment of my medications. However, I've been in medical lockdown this pandemic because my asthma is out of control. My doctor, at my appointment over the summer, stared me down and said, "You can't get sick, do you understand? Your lung functioning can't drop any further. You have no wiggle room left." But seizures are an emergency and could mean something bad, like a brain tumor. So I reluctantly went to the ER and sat in the waiting room. 10 minutes later, a covered patient comes in. She announces to the front desk that she's been diagnosed and is having trouble breathing. She's instructed to take a seat and wait. Now, with all the social distancing, there's limited seats available. The only one left is one exactly 6 feet away from me. There's no place left for me to go, so I listen to her cough and wheeze and struggle to breathe for half an hour, absolutely terrified that I was going to catch the virus. I got called back for some tests and was given a bed in the non-covered area, but it was in the hall. The hospital was so full that all of us non-covered patients were crammed together in one ward. I was right by the doors that led into the covered hall and got to watch doctors in full hazmat suits walk around. I kept thinking it looked like a movie in there. And then a trauma patient was brought in and wheeled to an observation room. The curtains were pulled, but it was one of those glass-walled rooms, so you could still sort of see in. There were a lot of nurses and doctors running in and out, and there was a lot of blood. It was sort of pooling on the floor. The patient was yelling, not screaming, but making those deep, loud, animal-like groans that says they don't have the air or energy for a full scream. And all of us, stacked up in beds along the wall, tried not to look because it felt like we were witnessing something private. But those groans, they carried across the entire ward. It was terrifying. I could see some of the other patients trying not to cry. And to the other side of me, right over the cubicle wall, a nurse was on the phone talking about insurance and medical bills, and sounding bored and robotic, like she'd answered all of these questions hundreds of times before. It was absolutely surreal. I got out a couple of hours later, but the entire experience was just... I still can't find the words to describe it. I'd never been so afraid in my life. Afraid for myself, afraid for the patients, afraid for the doctors. Just afraid for everyone going through it. I had intestinal surgery when I was about 13. Recovery was about 7 days, to be sure that all the plumbing was working properly. Well, about the 5th day I had woken up to a fairly large wet spot covering my crotch and gown. Turns out I had a wet dream and was still unable to move easily to clean myself, so I had to inform the nurse. I know it's not much compared to these others, but to a 13-year-old it was a nightmare. I was strapped down and on a ventilator. I woke up and I was on heavy drugs, so I kept thinking I was in a very bad dream and trying to get out. I only did that a couple times, but I remember having to be told it was real and not a dream. Whatever I think is real as the dream, and after a few seconds it would clear up. When I was between 3 and 4 I had to have emergency abdominal surgery for a blockage. The scariest thing I've seen was either my parents having to stop at the double doors that visitors can't pass as they hurriedly rushed me to the surgical area. Mom crying on dad's shoulder, dad looking very concerned. Or the guy they wheeled next to me in prep for the surgery. Back in the 70s they didn't care about privacy and there weren't curtains between patients, at least not in the surgery prep at this hospital. The guy next to me was an elderly man, unconscious with tape all over his face. I have no idea what the tape was for, probably just to hold an intubation tube or something, but in my mind it looked like they just carved his face up and used tape to put it back together. Scared the shit out of me. I didn't know what they were going to do to me, if I would look like that guy, etc. But shortly after that they gave me the happy gas and all was good. As a child I was hospitalized a lot due to heart issues. One day I was out in the halls waiting for the playroom to open up. I was about 8 at the time. There was a girl on my floor who walked with a huge machine that pumped her heart for her. She was walking around too with what looked like her mom or older sister. Suddenly her machine started beeping. The nurses rushed. They were speaking German. Since this was a Berlin hospital, I don't speak German, I'm Russian. The look on her face before she collapsed was absolutely horrific. Her eyes went almost blank and her lips were starting to go blue. Still haunts me, never found out what happened to her. Thanks for watching and share your stories. Don't forget to consider the idea to maybe think about potentially subscribing. Peace.